Hey, Peaceniks, we did it. We made it to the year 2022. Today's guest is Carlyn Zwarenstein, journalist and author of the book Opium Eater and the book she had her publisher send me, which I am grateful for. It was a great book and she did an outstanding job. The book is called On Opium. In it, she talks about her personal struggles with pain as she has an illness that causes her constant pain that she treats with a mild prescription opioid. When I asked her my first question, I asked her what led her to writing this book and how she has been affected by her illness, which she quickly said was two separate questions. I thought it was her illness that led her into the world of writing about opioid addiction, and so I was thrown off a little. I feel like in this podcast there were a few times when I brought up her issues with pain and didn't get the answer I was expecting, and it wasn't until the very end when I realized, after she said it more bluntly, that she didn't want to talk about her personal struggles with pain and that she wanted to focus more on the larger picture and the problems with the war on drugs and how it has been devastating for those who use opioids on the streets. I should have picked up on her more subtle hints earlier, but I didn't. But I did learn something on this episode: to listen more deeply, especially when talking about a subject that is very personal to someone else. But either way, we had a great conversation, and Carlyn has really done an excellent job as a writer, giving a voice to the voiceless, shining a light into the dark alleys that the drug users have been forced into by this pointless and inhumane war on drugs. So thank you for listening. And Carlyn, thank you for joining us on the Peace on Drugs podcast.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Drugs are menacing our society.
What are your thoughts on the drug problem?
I had a great time doing drugs.
So tonight, from our family to yours, from our home to yours, thank you for joining us.
This is the Peace on Drugs.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this podcast.
Yeah, you've been getting around. You're talking to so many people I know.
Yeah. I've been, it's like a whole universe on Twitter with everybody kind of in the same space. It's really cool. So I wanted to, you pronounce your name Carlyn, is that right?
Carlyn Zwarenstein. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for sending me this book. It was great reading it. I feel like I got to know you a little bit. So I have a whole list of things, that I went through from your book that I'd like to go, some of it we can go over. We don't have to get to all of it, but I'm going to start with, do you want to explain a little bit about what, got you to write this book, and about, talk about the ankylosing spondylitis and what, you go through as the pain management for that.
Okay. So those are two separate things. So maybe we'll just start with the one. Okay. So, the book is two books. The first part of it, which focuses on pain and opioid painkillers, was published as a really skinny little book that I have somewhere in 2016 by a really tiny publisher, and it did fine. Went out of print though. The publisher folded. So between 2016 and when the next book was written in 2020. I started to learn. The first book came out. I learned that it was being appreciated by people who were into harm reduction, and I actually didn't even know anything about harm reduction, very, very little. And so I started following. In that first book, my editor had pushed me to write about addiction and overdose and things that I didn't really know anything about and didn't care very much about. And so I started following that stuff, particularly following some journalists on Twitter and starting to form my own opinions and seeing that there were some people who seemed to be actually talking to the people experiencing the issue and some people who had a narrative that was very like tropes that were very easy, very like stereotyped, that I recognized from my experience with pain. And so I started starting to distinguish and to be able to see which ones seemed to be making sense. And I started reading the literature myself, and I found that there's a lot more that I had to say. And over that time, I started actually meeting and speaking to people who use illicit drugs. And I started to realize that issue of overdose and illicit opioids and then generally prohibition policies, which take in both kinds, it actually brings out some of the things I used to write about as a journalist, almost 20 years ago. When I've always, as a freelance journalist, I've always covered things of inequality, inequities, poverty, and social movements social movements led by the people experiencing the issue. And I started to see that in the world of illicit drugs and the way different overlapping, you have all these overlapping intersectional oppressions. You see that in a most concentrated form when you look at drugs. So I kind of returned to my original interest, and I became really obsessed with it and interested in it, and then formed these relationships and friendships with people experiencing these issues. So I had more to say. And that was the genesis of the other two parts of the book, which is 75% of the book.
Yeah. You talk a lot about the hard fact that the people that are hit the hardest from the war on drugs and the opioid crisis, as they're calling it, are the people that are, the Black and brown communities and the poor communities are hit really devastated. You talked about the pill mills that were kind of positioned in the poor areas. So when those were shut down, the first people to get cut off of their supply were the poorer communities, and they're a lot higher risk of overdose, suicide, and this is the big problem. So also your own, dealing with pain, what do they call long-term pain? You write about you have this constant fear that you could be cut off of your opiate supply because they're constantly cracking down, and this is a constant concern.
Yeah. I've been very little affected by what I understand is how I'm writing an article right now about Canadian pain patients and opioids, and in the process, I've learned that even here, my experience is a little bit different from a lot of people. Sometimes often that has to do with class, where you happen to be being treated. I take a very low dose of a very mild opioid, so that's part of it, but I don't think that's the only issue. The fact that I have a disease that is not necessarily more common in men, but is more thought to be more common in men, is more often identified in men, I think means that the entire way it's treated is quite different than if I had something like fibromyalgia, for example, that's thought to be more common in women. So my experience is a bit different, but I think like every single person who uses opioids and many who use other controlled substances have had the experience of having called in a prescription on a Thursday. It hasn't been filled by the Friday. It's a long weekend. There seems to be no real communication between the pharmacy and the doctor. No one's on call, and you're at risk of withdrawal. Like, it's not, as well as it being the thing that allows me to manage my life, it's there's a very urgent medical issue, and there seems to be very little attention to keeping a constant supply for people who are dependent on a substance. And experiences like that, and then needing to go to the pharmacy and not seem too eager to get the prescription, but also needing to secure that, things like that give you right away the sense of a sense of the reality of that. Yes, a small change in the attitude of the prescriber, of the pharmacist, of government policies, anything like that could change the thing that has fundamentally given me back my life.
Yeah, and so you're actually worried when you go to the pharmacy that if you seem too eager, they might get suspect. And
there's no other. There's various medications that I take to manage my condition, but there's no other one where it's very important not to say, well, I like this one, but this brand better than this, or I like this, or this isn't working. We like to use words that might imply that you like it. Where another thing, I'll say, I used to take a very strong anti-inflammatory that I used to take for menstrual cramps at a low dosage. And I used to say, oh, that thing saved my life. I love it. And later that particular thing has destroyed my gut, but at a dose for my spine. But it's completely, you can say things like that and it's not thought to have any deeper meaning. But I think everyone's conscious of the way things can be interpreted with a controlled substance, that anything you say could be weighed in a different way. And I don't know if I'm given what I see from other people, I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to think.
Yeah, I agree. I remember I was addicted to Vicodin for a few years, and every once in a while the person I would get it from, I think they got it from one of those pain pill places because they had a bunch, almost unlimited supply.
Right.
But every once in a while they'd run out. And I remember one time I was at the doctor trying to get tramadol because that was the one that they would, like, they wouldn't, if I said Vicodin, they wouldn't give it to me. But I remember having to try to act like I couldn't remember the name of it. Like it was called something like, and then they'd be like, tramadol. Like, yeah, I think that was it. Just because if I said tramadol, they'd be like, nope, he's looking for pain pills.
Yeah.
Which I was. But.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a very strange thing, and it sets up dishonesty. And like, I never asked for opioids. I never even came and asked for pain treatment. I just went to my doctor's office looking, clearly not managing, more as almost a mental health thing. And they could see that I was, they could see that I was suffering. And eventually, after trying everything else, that they ended up prescribing me the tramadol. But when you've been a patient for a very long time, you do start to, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And so it actually is natural to ask for things by name, to say this one caused these side effects, this one didn't, this dosage works for me, this doesn't. It actually is natural, but that level of expertise is seen as suspicious. And obviously for reasons, but the whole idea of suspicion is a framework that, whether for whatever reason you're using it, it's the wrong framework to approach a medical issue.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like you said, people know their bodies themselves. They know how. And also a lot of people that are seeking drugs, drug seeking, which is a term you said we need to get rid of. And I agree. Yeah. But there's David Pose has talked about it. These are people that are in pain, but it's mental pain. It doesn't have to be physical pain. People that, for whatever reason, and you even talked about, it's not just childhood trauma. There's the ongoing traumas of, poverty, racism, and things that are going to continue. And people self-medicate for these things. And the idea that if they're seeking reprieve from some of these, the idea that we punish them for seeking reprieve, we punish them for trying to find happiness.
Yeah, I think it would make more sense if you were able to have a context where you could genuinely say that this is why if it was someone looking for, where you could say, this is what I'm looking for it because I've heard this might help this thing, then you might be able to say, well, okay, is there something that might not result in dependence? Because no one particularly wants to be physically dependent on something. Is there something that, maybe this dose of something is actually going to cause side effects? If you could have an honest conversation with your doctor, I don't think you would have everyone taking pain pills. I don't think that's the natural result of honesty and being able to have a trusting relationship with your doctor. But the fact that law enforcement is involved in the whole process, and that there's this moralistic way of dealing with medicine makes it very hard to have that. There's a power relationship that makes it very hard to have an honest conversation.
Yeah, it is. And that's something Claire Zagorski brought up, was why we have law enforcement involved in medical issues in the first place. This is a medical thing. And we have basically militarized our police force to fight this war on drugs, something that they really have no business being behind. I mean, it's really kind of tragic. Also, harm reduction that you're talking about. I honestly, when I started this podcast, I started it simply as I saw the war on drugs, the problem it's caused for me personally, being arrested, dealing with addiction. And I was like, I want to talk about this, but I really hadn't done nearly enough research. Once I started doing the podcast, I realized there was so much to learn, so much to get into, and harm reduction was something I didn't know about. But I was really surprised when she said, and you also wrote in your book, that harm reduction, if you bring that up in a speech or whatever you're doing, you get no funding. If you say the word harm reduction, and say it's such a strange thing. How could harm reduction be a bad thing? You said we have how many safe injection sites around the world? Zero overdoses.
Zero deaths.
Zero deaths.
Many overdoses.
Yeah, they say when they overdose. That's the whole point of it. Yeah. You're right. But now in places that have legal access to heroin, like Switzerland, I'm pretty sure that they have almost zero overdoses. I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but it's so low compared to the United States, where we have 100,000 in the last 12 months. Yeah, that's something
it's unbelievable.
It really is. I was going to talk about, one thing that I learned from your book, I learned a lot, but one of the big things, because I just done an opioid crisis special, is at the end of my special, I kind of was giving addicts advice to what I think they could do, like fentanyl test strips you can buy. There's only so much you can do in this country. But one thing I suggested was trying to get sober. I know that's the obvious answer and the hardest. And I just said that I promised that a life is possible. A happy life is possible without opioids. And then reading your book, I realized that for some people, that's just not true. For me, it was true. So I assumed it could be true for everybody. But you talked about one of the guys, Joe, in your book. But he said in your book, he said, sober is a miserable state, anxious, light sensitive, on my toes. Part of it is how sharp my vision is. When I'm cold sober, everything feels like the sharpness setting is too high. And that's just something it was really shocking to think that people he tried sobriety for months at a time and it just wasn't working, right?
Yeah. I mean, in the context of overdose, there's the issue of, it's dangerous for someone who is dependent on an opioid and likely to relapse, which they are statistically likely to do, to be abstinent. Like it's actually dangerous. And so I think it should be presented to people as, this is a risky choice. Is there a way we can support you to ease into that if you really want to do it? But definitely, I don't think abstinence should be the default in that case. If you didn't have a situation of a toxic drug market, then it would be less dangerous, and it would be more of an issue of, okay, what is the way to maximize this person's life, and first of all, letting them have autonomy over their choices, but also there's levels of trauma where the damage is done, and whether the insistence on abstinence as the one good means that you miss out on a lot of daily goods. If a medication can allow you to get on with your life is pretty short. And so if it can let you get on with your life rather than spending your entire life finding ways to emotionally survive a trauma and physically survive something that is absolutely devastating. I guess having chronic illness has made me more aware of the shortness of life, and that sometimes you can spend so long and so much energy dealing with something. And yes, you may be able to deal with it in a non-pharmaceutical way, but it's not just a quick fix. It's actually something that allows you to do so many other things in your life if you're not spending the entire time in trauma therapy or mindfulness or meditating or whatever. I've had that experience with pain that I kind of have gotten sick of some of the various things that I do to manage it when I could just be getting on with my life. And I think for the complex PTSD, it's something I don't experience, but at some point, I think people know for themselves generally, but if they're given a set of there's all these possible options, do you want to spend your life doing this one? It may be that it just makes more sense to keep people on maintenance of something.
It is. What do you think the reasons are that we don't allow people, that if we think they're getting high versus actually treating pain, why do we care that they get high? What's the big problem with somebody feeling good?
It seems to me there's an idea of what high means that's a little different from the reality a lot of the time. Like we have an idea of intoxication that's very extreme, and that most people don't want to be in an ongoing way. So most people who are long-term users of a substance, it is more of they might be feeling good. That's, part of life. We have coffee and feel good. But the idea of this sort of extreme, stumbling, incoherent thing is very scary to people. And I think it's not realistic. It isn't really what the situation is. Often when you're actually describing withdrawal, when you're describing someone who's essentially incapacitated.
Exactly.
And so so that's combined with a sort of a Protestant moral attitude about suffering being good. And then that's enforced by the fact that we have a whole set of laws that make it seem okay. You just think of the way, like when gay marriage was illegal, that seemed, the fact that there were laws that made it not possible, made it also for many people, once it became legal, there's a legal thing in Canada at least, it suddenly became easier to grasp for people who had a moral thing against it, or apartheid in South Africa. Once the laws changed, people who kind of drifted along to a way of thinking were easily able to move to a different way of thinking. We've got this legal structure that is kind of enforcing our moral beliefs. And because there's laws about it, we assume it must be true. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's the case. We've just been living in this framework that was created 100 years ago, and we don't know any other way to be.
You're right. And you brought up the Protestant influence on these laws. And that's a huge thing in our country. Is that a big influence in your country as well?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It is. So I was surprised when I was talking to John Sharp, and he's in UK. He said that it doesn't affect their laws at all. He said it's weird that we have separation of church and state and they don't. And yet our laws are influenced so much by what the religious beliefs are. You can't even run for office in this country if you don't say you're a Christian, which is a strange thing.
It's hard to believe that you have. It's absolutely impossible to believe that you guys have separation of church and state.
I mean, we really don't. On paper, that's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I also want to dial back to something you said earlier. I wanted to ask you about. You said that you're the I hope I'm saying this right, ankylosing spondylitis. So that's a more men than women get. So
yeah, it used.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
No. Maybe finish your sentence.
Okay, no, I was just going to ask. So, what you were saying was that the reason that you think it's easier to be prescribed medicine is that because it's more men, that if it had been a more diseases that are more female oriented, are they that are less likely to prescribe for women if they're in pain?
I mean, yes, they are less. They're more likely to be seen as a mental health issue. I think ankylosing spondylitis used to be thought of as a male disease, and it particularly something that would hit you in your 20s, sort of in the prime of life, and so people were treated as serious, and serious meaning that, I mean, there's still an accepted order of operations in which opioids are the last thing there, but it just understood. You reach that point, then that's the appropriate treatment, and the way pain is measured is with these annoying scales, but your subjective impression is what is accepted. No one ever sort of looked at me funny when I'd say this is how I'm feeling. They'd ask a set of questions and they'd say, "Wow, that's really bad," and then they'd respond as appropriately for that. But people who have diseases that are other invisible diseases, like fibromyalgia is the one that comes to mind, that tends to be identified as a women's disease, although it's not. And there's no proof of it. It's the physical evidence. Now, in my case, I do have an MRI or an X-ray can see that there's damage to my spine, but the pain preceded the damage and is not associated closely with it. So it's absolutely possible to be in terrible pain with ankylosing spondylitis and not have radiographic evidence of that. So I don't know if it's because you can have your spine's physically changing. I don't know if that's why, but it seems to me that there's a real gender division in how things are seen that makes me suspect that part of it is just the way we react to men expressing pain. We assume that they're hiding it, that they're being very stoic, and that what they say is if they report pain, that is really bad, whereas women are thought to be exaggerating it.
That is just crazy. I mean, so the idea is that if I went in and said I'm in pain, and they're like, well, that's brave of me to come in and even say it, because that's probably been building up for a long time. Yeah, but if you go in there, they're just like, are you sure? Are you really I don't believe you. That's horrible. And I know that the same thing happens with minorities in this country. If you're Black and you go to the hospital, they're much less likely to prescribe you an opioid, which is
and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But I mean, doctors were taught. Things are changing all the time and changing in different areas. So I don't know to what extent it's changed, but certainly at various points, doctors were taught that Black people had a different pain response and actually felt less pain. So things like that. And then also around the pill mill time, there were some doctors observed that at that time there were lower rates of drug use and of prescription opioid use and of overdose in Black communities, which was largely because of undertreated pain, and because it hadn't hit those communities yet, right? Because of racial segregation. So, but they reported, white male doctors reported this very smugly. Look, these communities have been spared the opioid crisis because we're more careful about how we prescribe. They're mainly more careful because of previous stereotypes about Black people using heroin and about Black people not having a lower pain response. So these were all, it was a bunch of garbage. And it was inevitable that eventually those communities would also experience rising overdose rates. And indeed, that's what's happening. It's rising faster there than anywhere else. So it was a bunch of garbage, but a lot of ideas that reinforced each other.
Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to bring up was you brought up in the book that I really like because a lot of people don't see it this way with the Mexican cartel problem, especially our country is going through a huge thing where half of the country wants a wall built and thinks that the whole COVID thing is being caused by Mexicans. I mean, it's bizarre some of the things I hear when I ask someone in my family if they've been vaccinated, and their response is, why should I get vaccinated when there's thousands of Mexicans coming over every day with COVID? I'm like, that doesn't make any sense what you just said, but this is what's going on. But anyway, the war on drugs, and they're all coming over here with drugs. They don't understand the drug problem, but you said in your book, the war on drugs fueled by demand for drugs from the United States, empowered by guns smuggled in from the US and kept alive by global prohibition, has devastated Mexico. And that's the thing people don't realize. It's not a problem of production, or only a problem of production. It's a problem of consumption. If we weren't wanting the drugs and buying them, then there would be no problem.
Yeah, I mean, you ask anyone in Mexico, so the guns come from the US. And there's this insatiable demand for drugs from the US. Like, I would still see that differently because I'm anti-prohibition. So, but it's certainly not a one-way thing. And the US has been responsible for for the militarization of Mexico's response to try and keep drugs out of the US. And so it's been, there's huge, unbelievable human rights abuses perpetrated by US trained security forces, and a cycle of demand that then they try to crush by horrible policies in Mexico.
Yeah. They had like 33,000 deaths and violent deaths in 2018. And this is all, the United States funds their drug war. We started their drug war. We told them to outlaw opioids, or outlaw drugs, and they said no. They said that the drug cartels would be a problem if we did that, as they were in your country. And we said, all right, well, then we're going to cut off your opioid supply for your hospitals. So they folded and they outlawed drugs. And then now we're like, it's so bad down there, we should put up a wall. It's so ridiculous the way we're treating this.
On COVID, if they'd kept some certain, I think, college students out of resort areas in Mexico, they might not have had COVID when they did as well. I mean, it's a ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous scapegoating Mexico in this way.
It is. So how much blame do you put on my country for all this? It's like all of it, I guess.
A lot, but it's policies developed largely 100 years ago, and then a security apparatus and like industries of unregulated rehab, industries of surveillance of patients, industries of surveillance of people with addiction. Like, there's a whole financial, as with most American things, it's not American people, it's certain policies that are financially self-interested. So it's a real minority who are benefiting from this, and then a whole lot of people in misery.
That's 100% true, and to turn the ship around is going to be really hard because of these industries that we've created through the drug war machine, right? Like private prisons, which is a crazy concept that we're going to profit off of people's incarceration. And then we have all the law enforcement. The DEA has a reason not to win what they're fighting, because if they win what they're fighting, they no longer exist.
Exactly.
It's absolutely really scary. I do like the idea that it's slowly starting to turn a little bit. Now, I was talking to David Poses, and he thinks, and I'm curious what your opinion is, but I was telling him, I was like, we're not talking about legal heroin that you can just walk into a store and buy. We're talking about you have to get a prescription, talk to your doctor. And he immediately cut me off and it's like, I disagree. He's like, you should be able to go in a store and buy it on a shelf. And I don't disagree with him. I think, though, one step at a time, if we try to sell that, it's going to go crazy. But also, it's a little hard to swallow the idea that you could just go and get heroin. But he said, if alcohol is that easy to get, why can't I get heroin? That's his point. What do you think about?
I think it's hard to say yet what a world without prohibition would look like. And I don't know, I'm not necessarily pro like incremental things. You could do this all at once. But I think we still don't know what it would look like. One caution that I would have would be that the system, a legally regulated system, needs to be designed for public and not for commerce, not for profit. And that's exactly where things would trip up in the US. And that's where, so if you had, for example, like the heroin buyers club concept that has been advanced in Canada, that would be small groups of people, community-based, self-run, bulk purchasing heroin. That would be that in a different vision. Some of the vision that I laid out there could be fair trade, thus supporting small farmers in Mexico, and it would be an idea of gradually moving people's doses down to something that allows them to live and be comfortable. So something like that, I could certainly imagine a system where you're getting a little back to what we had at the end of the 19th century, when very low potency opioid products were available commercially. That wasn't well done because, again, there was heavy marketing, there was poor understanding of safety and dosage, and so the same problems that existed then are the problems that are potential issues now. But there were the degree of harm that existed then was quite, like, relatively speaking, very little compared to what we've had in the ensuing 100 years. So it is possible to imagine a situation where the creation of stronger doses of things is a creation of prohibition. So if you were to remove that, you could move to something where you're not talking about something that is actually as dangerous. And so when you talk about walking in and getting heroin off the shelf, ultimately in that future vision, it's not the same thing as it was. But the way of getting there is harder to tell. And yes, I don't want my kids walking into a store and buying heroin off the shelf, but that's not what we're imagining. If you remove the prohibition laws and you redesign a regulated system in such a way that it's not overly medicalized, which creates its own problems, and it's not overly commercialized, then you could have a system that is just where substances of all kinds are treated in a much more normal and balanced way. And the kind of scary visions that we have of that, there's no reason that those would exist.
Mm-hmm. I think the commercialization is a problem. It's been a problem with alcohol. Alcohol has become such a part of our culture because it's constantly viewed as this sexy, really cool thing to do at the beach with your friends. They don't have a commercial with some of the realities of alcohol, which is, I've talked to paramedics who go, all the houses they go to was alcohol, opioid, alcohol, and I think so. If we did legalize opioids, there are states in our country where if you want alcohol, you can't get it at a grocery store. There's special stores for alcohol, and you can go get it. You don't need a medical card. And maybe we do that with the opioids. Like, you can get it, but it's not going to be a impulse buy it at the grocery store. It's going to be, you're going to specifically go there for that. Yeah.
So we've just set up that system with cannabis. The problems, at least in Ontario where I am, is that it's been a highly commercialized version of it, which is, there aren't some of the same harms as with highly commercialized opioids or alcohol, but there certainly are harms in the way it's being done, and it's certainly not, the people who are making a profit are not the people who suffered under the war on drugs either. So doing it differently would mean that it's regulated for public health rather than for profit.
Mm-hmm. And that is going to be a huge problem in this country. Not even a problem. When we legalize, whatever we legalize, it will be for profit. That's how our country does things. I mean, I don't think you could do that safely for alcohol. I don't think you could do that safely for opioids. It's not. I agree. I think
I think it has to be done together. You have to get rid of the two things, prohibition and that health being a matter of profit at the same time. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's any way to solve those problems otherwise.
That's a really steep hill to climb in this country, for people to understand that not everything revolves around money. It's really tragic too when we have so many people dying every year. and we're not willing to look at it as a health crisis. Well, we are starting to look at it that way a little bit, but even in the news, when they talk about, like, they got my assistant send me something, said, are you interested in talking to this group of people? And it was Families Against Fentanyl. I haven't looked into it yet, but just the name in itself kind of makes me wonder. Go ahead.
Those are the ones who said they want to have them declared a weapon of mass destruction, right?
Probably.
I think that's the one that was on social media saying that, which just makes me think you declare them a weapon of mass destruction and you bomb them out of existence.
Exactly.
Just in case you have some fentanyl around. It's completely ridiculous. And I mean, there's an issue with media and how they're portraying things as well that just has no relation to reality and really makes it very hard to make any change.
It is. Yeah, if you make fentanyl the enemy, that's what they make the opioid crisis. It's opioids are the problem, as if the opioids are coming over here and jumping in people's mouths. I mean, that's not the problem. And if they were illegally available, it wouldn't be a crisis at all. So I hope we can get somebody from Families Against Fentanyl in here, because I'd like to talk to somebody who might disagree with me a little. I'd like to just see if we could have a conversation, because maybe they're not seeing the picture. A lot of these people probably lost loved ones, and I understand going through grief and wanting to blame something, but they might just not understand that their blame is being misplaced in a drug that is safely used in hospitals every single day.
Yeah. Agreed.
So, I was thinking, because you the first time I ever put it together, what endorphins mean, was from your book, Endogenous Morphine. I don't know why I never put that together, but I was talking with David Poses, and we were talking about, people do things to make them happy, and they can become addicted to them, things like running. And he's like, but running's not necessarily, he's like, I'm not going to say running's as bad as heroin. Running's good for you. He's like, but still, people find things that become addicted to. And I didn't think about it on the podcast, but really though, people that become addicted to running are addicted to their endogenous morphine, their endorphins.
Possibly. Yeah.
Possibly. I mean, again, not saying it's unhealthy.
There's actually been some of the new research is suggesting that the runner's high idea is actually more your endocannabinoid system. So really? I wouldn't make firm conclusions on it yet, but I mean, the basic idea that yes, we like to feel good. It's a natural human impulse. Really? And not a bad one.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was a combination of both, but when I go for a run and I get that feeling, it definitely feels more like the side of the morphine that gives you the energy. It feels like that. It doesn't feel like I'm high on cannabis at all. But I don't know what the endogenous cannabinoids feel like. Maybe, I don't know. It's strange. But I was just thinking, like, the idea that we don't outlaw, like, we could criminalize things people like to do that could be dangerous. Skydiving, climbing cliffs. There's so many activities people do that we don't criminalize. But for some reason, people that go inward with their adventures is immediately out, like, no, can't do that. And I don't know. I was just thinking, because I went for a run after the podcast, and I was just thinking, like, what if they would say, oh, runners have more likely to get by cars, get attacked by dogs, so we're going to outlaw running. So I was like, all right, well, I'll just get a treadmill. And then they go, well, you can't do a treadmill because that's a slippery slope to going back to running in the roads. So I outlaw treadmills, and then, like, all right, I'll just build one and I won't tell them, and I'll run in the garage. And then they have, like, monitors that monitor heart rates at houses. And that's pretty much what the growing your own cannabis in your own house kind of thing is. Like, we're going to, like, what if I just do it at my home? Nope. We're going to fly over your house and see if there's any heat lamps. And it's just so that was a funny thought I had after the podcast. I was like, I wish I would have talked to David about this, but I wanted to talk to you. This morning I was going over some of the notes for this podcast, and I looked up, when I was reading your book, I didn't look at, I'm trying to find her name. I wrote it on here somewhere. The artist, Frida Kahlo.
Yeah. It's the Mexican artist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I saw some of her paintings today online for the first time, and I was actually really moved. They were kind of dark, but she was, in a very painful place. But one of the things she said on her way to the hospital, she said, I hope the leaving will be joyful, and I hope never to return. And I was wondering, was she talking about the hospital, or was she talking about, leaving this world?
Yeah, I can't remember. There are a few of the quotes that I put, if you look at the footnotes, that I wasn't able to confirm them for sure. I'm not sure if that one might have been one that was actually from her diaries, and she definitely said it. There's a lot that's floating around that she never actually said. But yeah, I think I don't think anyone knows, because it's not clear whether she actually died of an intentional overdose or not. I don't know. I don't know the truth of that.
Yeah, she said another quote. might not have been hers then, but I tried to drown my sorrows, but the damn things learned to swim.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. So she used alcohol. She became dependent on the painkillers that she took. Whether she was addicted to them, I don't know. But she certainly had an extraordinarily hard life with very long-term pain, and actually got through a lot of it with both alcohol and a morphine like another opioid.
And for my listeners who don't know about her, we just briefly describe what happened.
Yeah. So Frida Kahlo is this wonderful Mexican painter who lived in Mexico City. She was married to Diego Rivera, who's sometimes more famous. I'm not sure who's more famous now, but the muralist. She had polio as a child, so she had one leg that was somewhat withered, and then she suffered as an art school student, I think, or a high school student still. She was in a trolley accident, and the pole, I guess, that you hold on to rammed through her pelvis. So huge reconstructive surgery, months and months of in bed, and chronic pain that never left her. She had tried to have children and miscarried, and she had unbelievable spine pain. She used to have to wear braces that were designed for her by her doctors to try and help. But anyway, she died, I think, at 53. And yeah, it's not clear whether it was possibly an overdose of the pain medication that she took or not. But during her life, she made the most incredible paintings that were, she would sometimes, she would paint from her bed with an easel set up above her head, and painted her life. So she painted a lot of very metaphorical things showing the actual experience of pain. And she's known for her kind of joie de vivre, that she really grabbed a lot out of life. So it's quite joyful as well as very agonizing, very painful.
And she was somebody that you admire and also can relate to in some ways, in that, you know, you go on these long adventures, long flights that can be painful, but you live your life.
To the extent you can, yeah. And
another person you brought up only once in your book, but I was curious because you just brought up a quote from him, but Haruki Murakami, are you a fan?
Bit of a fan. I've got some of his books. I'm not it's not my favorite, but yeah, I read a lot of his stuff and I like it.
Yeah, I've only read two of them, but he's a very strange writer. It's like he takes you into his dreams, and not it's not a lot to solve, but it's just a really cool way he tells a story that doesn't. It's just
he's an interesting writer.
Yeah, I'm a fan. I like it. Also, I've never been to Japan, and that's like a bucket list thing. So when I read his books, I kind of feel like I'm there. Really cool.
Yeah.
Good writer.
Did you read his book about running?
No.
He's written this book as like what he's talking about, what I'm talking about when I talk about running. And it's about, he uses running as a metaphor for writing. And so it's a bit of sort of a memoir, I guess, of writing and running. He's a marathon runner.
I didn't know that.
A very serious runner and very interesting person.
Write that down to look into. Just got his latest book, and I haven't had a chance to read it because since I started the podcast, I'm constantly reading about the war on drugs and opioid stuff, and I haven't done any pleasure reading since I started. But,
make some time.
Yeah, I'm going to actually. So I told my assistant, I was like, let's not book authors for a few months. I'm gonna get some other reading done, and then we'll go back. But I really, really enjoyed though your book and David's book, and getting to talk to authors. This has been one of my dreams of doing this podcast, is getting an author on here and talk about what it's like. I write songs. I've written things for myself, but I have a lot of respect for what it would take to put together a book like that. All the work it would take. So, how are you feeling today, by the way? I meant to ask you that.
I'm okay. I guess I save that kind of stuff for the book. I find that after writing this, I'll have people come and sit down in front of me and ask me how my pain is, or how is your body today? And I actually find that very uncomfortable. I'm going around living my life as best I can. And I guess I'm put quite a separation. I've had people asking how I'm able to be so like vulnerable and open in writing. And I think one way of doing it is that I see it very much as not therapy, as a material for making literature and for writing. And so I'm very comfortable using material from my life in a very detached way. It's very different in person. I actually don't know how to be honest or forthright about that. I'm fine.
Okay.
But, it's not something I don't tend to talk about it that much with people in my life.
Okay. I understand that. So we can, is there anything else you'd like to add that you want to the podcast before we?
No, these were amazing, interesting questions. I'm just happy to talk about. I find all of this absolutely, like, I love talking about it. It's interesting. It's fascinating. I've just gotten more and more interested. I really hope not to write a third book that has opium in the title. I think it's time to move on, but I love this kind of conversation, and I'm happy to kind of go anywhere that's interesting to you. So yeah, just thank you. This isn't any other point I want to hammer through, I don't think.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast and talking with me. This has been great.
Thanks so much, Aaron.
All right. I'll hopefully talk to you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay,
thank
bye-bye.
you. Bye. All right. Peace, Nicks. Thanks for listening. Remember, subscribe to our newsletter, www.thepeaceondrugs.com. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. If you like what we're doing, go on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star rating. And thank you so much for listening and being a part of this with me. And I will see you next week. Peace out.
What you get, you pay for what you get, you pay for what you get, you pay for what you get. Are you my doctor? Are you my dealer? Are you my doctor?